Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into corporate governance, a topic that sits right at the heart of how modern companies are run, how power is distributed and how organizations are held accountable. Whether you're studying company law, preparing for assessments or just interested in how big corporations operate, this short lecture will give you a clear overview of the key concepts, principles, and real-world implications. Let's begin with some basic terminology. When we say corporate, we mean the company as a legal entity. Governance simply means management, direction, or control. I also want you to remember two very important terms. The company constitution, which is found in the Articles of Association of the company, the members, who are the shareholders. These terms will become essential as we look at who holds power and how decisions are made in the company. Before we go deeper, think about the analogy of how a country is governed. We have a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary. Each of these has different roles and powers. Corporate governance works similarly. Companies also have key organs, each with distinct responsibilities. Keep that comparison in mind as we go along. So what is corporate governance? A very widely used definition comes from the Cadbury Report, which can actually be thought of as starting the whole discipline in 1992. The Cadbury Report defines it as corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. There are two key ideas from this definition. Firstly, how the company is governed, and secondly, to what purpose it is governed. Traditionally, the purpose was seen as maximizing profits for the members of the company. But modern governance recognizes broader social responsibilities beyond the duty to the shareholders or the members of the company. Now, originally, you'll remember that companies were very closely resembling partnerships. But then we had the very groundbreaking decision in Salomon versus Salomon, in which we recognize that companies have their own separate legal personality and that therefore we could limit the liability of the people who actually own the company. Now, this led to a fundamental concept in company law, which is the separation between ownership and management. And we get this particularly in the larger public companies, not so much in private companies where ownership and management and shareholding, as a matter of fact, tend to be vested in the same people. So thinking about the larger public companies, and with the separation between ownership and management, shareholder or members own the company, but they do not run it on a day-to-day basis. The management of the company would typically be in the hands of a separate set of people, namely the directors, who as a collective form the board of directors. Now, this separation creates both opportunities as well as problems, especially around accountability. And much of corporate governance is about managing these challenges. So who are the main organs in a company? Well, firstly, there's the shareholders, and as a collective, we'll find them in the annual general meeting. And then there's the board of directors, made up of both executive and non-executive directors. Potentially, we also have committees such as audit or remuneration committees, and each of these organs play a different role in shaping how the company operates. The two main organs, the directors and the shareholders. The board of directors report to the shareholders, whereas the shareholders in turn elect the board of directors, forming a closed loop. Shareholders play two important roles. Firstly, as part of governance, their decisions can control and influence directors. And at the end of the day, remember, shareholders can always remove directors. Secondly, as individuals or individual investors, where they exercise their rights personally, such as enforcing duties or challenging decisions. Even minority shareholders have power in this regard. Do go and have a look at the videos that I did on the management of companies, as well as shareholder remedies, such as the derivative action and the unfair prejudice petition. However, shareholders usually exercise their influence collectively through resolutions, which are votes on specific topics. So shareholder decisions are made through these resolutions, which are votes on a proposition, and these must follow the procedure in the company's specific articles of association. There are different types of resolutions. Firstly, the ordinary resolution, which is formed from a simple majority. Then special resolutions, which require a 75% majority in favor. And then we also have, for instance, written resolutions, which we find for private companies only. Also note, not all shares carry voting rights, and shareholders can appoint proxies to vote on their behalf. Key statutory provisions include sections 281 to 288 of the Companies Act 2006. Meetings of shareholders are another essential part of governance. The AGM refers to the annual general meeting of the shareholders. The GM would be the general meeting, and then we'd also have ad hoc class meetings for holders of a particular class of shares. So different meetings serve different purposes, and they all may have different notice requirements. As you can see on the slide here, we've got Tim Cook, who was conducting at the time his first shareholders meeting. Public companies must hold an annual general meeting within 6 months of their financial year end in terms of section 336 of the Companies Act 2006. Failing to do so is an offence, in other words, a crime, for the company and its officers. Private companies do not have to hold annual general meetings unless they choose to. Annual general meetings require 21 days notice unless every member agrees to a shorter period. Typical annual general meeting agendas include items such as reviewing company accounts, appointing auditors, electing or re-electing directors, declaring dividends, etc. Now, these are fundamental issues that require shareholder approval. Who can call an annual general meeting? Well, firstly, directors. The Articles of Association, in fact, usually delegate this power to the directors. Then members. Members may require the directors to call a general meeting if they hold at least 10% of the paid-up voting capital, or in the case of a private company, 5% of the paid-up voting capital, if more than 12 months have elapsed since the last general meeting. The directors must call a meeting within 21 days of receiving such a request, and the meeting must then take place within 28 days of the notice convening the meeting. If the directors do not call a meeting, the members who requested the meeting may then themselves call a meeting to take place within 3 months of the initial request, and they can recover the expenses that they incur in doing so from the company. A resigning auditor may also require the directors to convene a meeting to explain the reasons for their resignation. And finally, the court. On the application of a director or a member where it would otherwise be impracticable, for example, if there is a deadlock, these ensure that meetings cannot be suppressed by management. Corporate governance should align with the company's objectives as set out in the Constitution. Now, traditionally, the objective of all companies would be profit maximization, but modern approaches recognize that there are broader impacts that companies could have on society. For example, on employees, on consumers, even the environment, and if the company is large enough, it could have national implications on a company's GDP. So corporate governance is not just academic, it affects real lives, especially when we're dealing with the big multinational companies. Because corporate collapses could lead to job losses, losses of pensions, disruption of essential services, huge costs to the public. Just think about the cost to the taxpayers, for example, in the last financial crisis where they had to bail out failing banks. Environmental harm if companies aren't governed properly. Think about energy suppliers. What if our large energy companies go bust? Transport companies, large banks, when they fail, the consequences ripple through society and can be very severe. Some famous examples of corporate collapses that had tremendous impact on society include the following. In the United States, there were the collapses of Enron, Arthur Andersen, and Lehman Brothers. Do go and Google these. They're very interesting to read up on. Books have been written about them. Hollywood movies were made. Documentaries were made. In the UK, round about the 2008 financial crisis, we had the collapse of Northern Rock and the Royal Bank of Scotland. Very interesting to read up on this person, Fred Goodwin, who was at the head of Royal Bank of Scotland. And he was nicknamed Fred the Shred, go and find out why, or the man who sank a bank. And what happened there was so egregious that the Queen stripped him of his knighthood. It was the biggest corporate disaster in British history, and fingers crossed it doesn't get repeated in my lifetime. So these failures, just finally, they highlighted poor governance, lack of oversight, weak auditing, and excessive risk-taking, all things that should be prevented with good corporate governance. So corporate collapse because of bad governance affects not just shareholders, but employees, suppliers, communities, the wider public. And for that reason, good corporate governance is a matter of public interest, not just internal company policy. So who are the stakeholders in a company? We know that shareholders are stakeholders, but who else? Well, there's the directors, employees, creditors, institutional investors, which would be the large investors such as pension funds, the public, and the good governance intends to balance all of these interests. So just to continue with the importance of corporate governance, good corporate governance balances these interests. It promotes ethical behavior, it increases accountability, and it encourages long-term instead of short-term decision-making. Good corporate governance reduces the risk and protects the public. It is the backbone of a healthy corporate ecosystem, and the healthier corporations are, the more attractive they are to investors. The more healthy corporations we have in a specific economy, the stronger the economy tends to be. Some major corporate governance challenges include the following. Firstly, the principal-agent problem. In corporate governance, this problem arises because the owners of the company, that means the principals, the shareholders, or the members, these owners of the company delegate the day-to-day control to the managers or directors of the company, which are the agents of the company. Now, since the managers may pursue their own interests, such as higher pay, job security, or short-term performance, rather than what best benefits shareholders, a conflict can develop. Good corporate governance seeks to align incentives and introduce oversight mechanisms to ensure that managers act in the company's and in the shareholders' best interest. There are also the following other issues. Who gets decision-making power? Financial reporting and auditing may become problematic if fraud is involved. Directors' remuneration is always a hot-button topic. And auditor independence may lead to abuses, as we saw in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. So accountability and transparency is also a key issue. And these issues as a collective are at the center of reforms in the UK and globally. Some further concerns include risk management, where the core concern is often how to balance short-term profit with long-term stability. Are we chasing short-term profits and taking loads of risks, which could mean that the company faces no viable future? Or are we thinking long-term? There's also the quality of communication between companies and their shareholders. Sometimes there's a disconnect. Further, the appropriate levels of regulation. Should companies be left to manage themselves? That is internal regulation. Or should regulation come from outside the companies? That is externally, from, for instance, statutory regulatory bodies. A significant framework here is the Companies Act 2006, and in particular its provisions on the duties of directors. And finally, increasingly corporate governance, the way in which companies are run, is seen as not just a business but also an ethical issue. In the UK, the key developments leading to our current corporate governance regime include the following. The Cadbury report kicked it all off in the early 1990s. It emphasized the role of non-executive directors. The Cadbury Code in time became the Combined Code, which went through several iterations into corporate governance codes, and the latest corporate governance code is the one published in 2024. The Corporate Governance Code is the UK's premier soft law instrument on corporate governance. The hard law on corporate governance comes from the Companies Act 2006, especially its provisions on directors' duties, with other acts such as the Insolvency Act also contributing to the regulation of companies. International instruments and reforms such as the OECD principles and the United States Sarbanes-Oxley Act also play a major role in how we think about corporate governance. So these provide frameworks that shape how companies must operate. So what is good corporate governance? Well, there are certain basic principles, and I'm going to look at 6 of them, starting with the first one. The first principle of good corporate governance is the notion of executive oversight, which we find expressed in the splitting of powers between executive and non-executive directors. Executives run the company, whereas non-executive directors are supposed to oversee how the executives do their job. To facilitate this, different board structures exist. Firstly, there's the unitary or one-tier board structure, such as we find typically in Anglo-American jurisdictions. So in the United Kingdom, for example, we've got one board of directors, and on that one board of directors, you'll find a mix of executive and non-executive directors. The chair of the board would be the leader of the non-executive directors, whereas the chief executive officer would be at the head of the executive directors. The non-executives are supposed to provide independent oversight over what the executives are up to. Then we find the 2-tier board, which is typical for continental jurisdictions such as Germany. In the German model, we've got 2 boards of directors instead of 1. One would be the supervisory board, on which we find the non-executive directors, and typically we'll also include employees on this board. And secondly, you'll have the management board, which would have the executive directors. These structures influence accountability and decision-making, but what both of them have in common is the splitting between executive and non-executive functions. Further principles of good corporate governance include accountability. That would mean accountability of the directors to stakeholders, sometimes more stakeholders than just the shareholders. Independence, especially independence of auditors. Fairness, responsibility. So responsibility, once again, to whom? It could be to the shareholders, but also to employees, creditors, environmental responsibilities, etc. And then finally, there's also the notion of fairness and responsibility, which goes further than the traditional corporate governance principles. And we'll look at that at the end of this lecture. Now, most of these concepts appear in the Corporate Governance Code 2024, as well as the United Kingdom's Stewardship Code 2026. Do go and have a look at these 2 codes and familiarize yourself with the principles contained in them. Finally, corporate governance is very closely linked to a related area or a related discipline, which is called corporate social responsibility, or CSR, which in turn is about how companies consider their impact on society, environmentally, socially, and ethically. And it's often said that corporate social responsibility starts where corporate governance ends. Corporate governance would be about all of the regulations imposed on companies. These could come from soft law, such as the codes, as well as hard law, such as statutes, including the Companies Act and the Insolvency Act. However, corporate social responsibility arises organically or voluntarily from the company itself. This would be the internal principles that the company set for itself. It is of great interest to scholars and also directors and managers where the dividing line between this voluntariness and the compulsion should be drawn. What should we leave up to companies to decide for themselves, and what should we actually mandate? So key questions include: should directors take into account the interests of stakeholders apart from shareholders, employees, creditors, the environment, society, consumers? All of these are stakeholders. Another key question is, should shareholders be more involved in the daily running of companies? This is a problem if you've got thousands and thousands of shareholders. And also, what is the global responsibility of big corporations that are in certain instances even bigger than the GDP of certain countries, such as, for example, Facebook? On the other hand, are we expecting too much of companies? Was the great economist Milton Friedman right to insist that the business of business is business? I'd be interested to hear what you think about that, so do leave a comment below. So thank you for watching this short overview of corporate governance. If you found this useful, don't forget to please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with any questions. I always enjoy hearing from you. See you in the next lecture.